Heaven, in my opinion, has a big marketing problem. Nobody wants to go. Have you noticed? Nobody really wants to go. When you talk about heaven, people are polite, but you can tell by the look in their eyes and the tone in their voice, they're thinking, I don't even like harp music. Why would I want to play one on a cloud forever? More proof that heaven has a marketing problem. No one wants to die. People will take any kind of pill or supplement, do any kind of treatment to not die, even though that's the only entrance into heaven. And I think our attitude about heaven was probably well summed up by Mark Twain. He said, if you want good weather, go to heaven. But if you'd like interesting company, go to hell. Do you see that a lot of us have that somewhere in the background? Heaven's very nice, but it's boring. And we have to give up way too much to go there. And is that really what we want? And I think tonight's readings show that heaven has a big marketing problem. I don't know how many of you got to taste any of those podcasts that we started here in the parish since the pandemic began. They're called Profiles of Endurance, and they feature people like you. There are people sitting here right now who were featured in a profile of endurance. And one of them was on the topic of loss, and it was with a Ravenna parishioner, Mary Jane Persico, who many of you know. She's a wonderful, wonderful woman, and she's had a lot of losses. So I asked her, Mary Jane, when you think of heaven, what do you think of? And she said, Father, I have a very simple faith. When I think of heaven, I think of a great big family dinner where nobody has to go home early and there's more food than any of us could ever eat. To me, heaven is just home. And what we hear in the readings tonight is, Mary Jane, you got it. That's exactly what heaven is like. Heaven is like, Jesus says, a king who gives a great banquet. And it is the best food you've ever had. And it is exactly the right company. When you see who's sitting at your table, you say, yes. And you're so thrilled to be there. And it says that what we will say aloud when we get to this experience is, behold God in person. Why did we ever have a doubt? Why would we ever have had a minute with a doubt? That's what the people in heaven say. Oh, it's even better than we hoped. It was all true and then some. St. Teresa of Avila said, heaven is being in the presence of God. Heaven is not a place, and the scripture said that too. Heaven's not a place. It says the kingdom of heaven is like a king who has a banquet. It's not a place. It is outside of time and place. It is in God's realm, and it is being in the presence of God. And the way St. Teresa of Avila said this, I love. She said, wherever his majesty is, there too is heaven. Wherever his majesty goes, wherever his majesty places a foot, there is heaven. And so, if we're going to be honest with ourselves about what that means, we're here now in God's presence. We are tasting heaven. Because when you are in the presence of the Lord, you are there. And so what that means for Mary Jane Persico and all of us is that we have actually tasted heaven on earth. Maybe that's why we don't ever want this to end. Do you suppose that's why we get so attached? Because we've tasted heaven right here. And Mary Jane has hosted many, many meals when all of her children were there. And I've been to her house for dinners that I'll never forget. And so being in heaven is not playing a harp on a cloud. It is being in the presence of God. It is feeling God's love and realizing that you're doing it while you're doing it. It's being in the moment and not only realizing it after the fact. It's saying those words, here we are, really in God's presence. At a moment like this, I wonder, how could I ever doubt? There is a sister of the resurrection who lives at the Mother House in Castleton. She's one of those nuns in that Polish order, and they wear the habit. They usually wear a gray or black dress with a simple cross. And my grandmother's sister was in that community, and I've always been close to them. And I've been friends with her for about 15 years, and I went to visit her recently. And she grew up in a big Polish family in Schenectady, and she's the baby of this big family, and she's in her 80s now. And so she remembers a time and some customs that a lot of us just hear about. She said that when she and her 6 brothers and sisters were going off to school in the morning, their family had a custom. The mother, whenever they were done with breakfast and were getting their backpacks on to go out the door, would say, in Polish, "Go with God, my children." And they would say back in Polish, "Stay with God, dear mother." Isn't that beautiful? They had another tradition when they'd come home from school too, but just to stay focused on this one, "Go with God," she told her children. And they understood what she meant and would say back, "Okay, and you stay with God." It was clear to them at an early age that that was possible, that God was there and here at the same time, that they could be apart and yet still be with God. They could understand God's going with you and staying with me. And isn't that what we hope for at every funeral? That we'll be able to sense that? You go with God, we'll stay with God until we go with God. Isn't that exactly what we're hoping for? How interesting that the psalm that the church chose for today is the psalm that you've heard at funerals. Isn't that interesting? Because that's what we're supposed to be thinking about right now. How can we grow in our relationship with heaven? How can we fix heaven's marketing problem? If not out there, at least inside of us. So this week, I think the homework for us is, can we grow in sensing heaven here so that we don't have to completely wait for it? Can we start to get better at noticing when we are in the presence of God in real time and not just after the fact? Can we be part of that presence? Can we enter into the energy field that would be, the love and the gentleness and the goodness and the harmony of that? You know, a lot of us are finding it really hard to remember that we are in God's presence because it feels like we've been going through something other than heaven the past 7 months. And now that we're getting close to an election that's really contentious, it's getting harder and harder and harder. I think that's why there was a sign in front of the Reformed Church in New Baltimore this week that says, "We don't have to agree on anything to be kind to one another." Such an important reminder. Kindness doesn't require us to agree on a single thing. We still must be kind. So maybe this week, if we want to taste heaven a little more in real time, to really bring that presence here, to know that those who've gone to heaven have gone with God and we're staying with God, we may need to decide to give ourselves a little bit of a fast from Facebook or from Twitter right now. It might be time to get off of it. Maybe we need to not watch the news, or to not watch the news channel that we always watch, to watch something that maybe just has a little different sound to it so it doesn't get us caught in a cycle. If we want to taste heaven, we're not going to be able to get into some war of comments on social media. That's not going to give us the taste that we're looking for. If we want to taste heaven, we need to eat together. We need to make time for each other. We need to have all sorts of space that allows us to gather, and socially distant though it may need to be. I am aware that there are members of the Coleman family here today and friends, and all of us are still dealing with the sorrow that we're feeling from the loss that that family has had, saying goodbye to their beloved Nulig. And one of the nieces from that family saw me recently, and I asked her where she was going, and she said, "Oh, I'm going over to Finbar's." And I said, "Oh," she goes, "Oh yeah, we go every day. We eat together every day." And she said, "You know, Father, when my father died years ago, the Colemans came over to our house every day." She said, "Feasting together, that's what helps, you know. That's what helps. Being together and eating together and reminding each other that we're all going to get through this." So that's what the Colemans are doing right now. They recognize that Nulig went with God, and they're staying here with God. And that's what heaven is like.